People often say that Easter is religious in nature, that it's something Christian or pagan in origin. I'm here to tell you, it's something far different than you've ever dreamed. I grew up in a small town in northern Europe, one of those picturesque little villages that you see on postcards. The kind with lots of farms, a cute little main street area that's all cobbled stone and brick buildings, a little downtown area with an open-air market, and lots of hard-working people in rustic clothes with various farming implements herding animals to and fro. I lived above one of those shops with my parents. They ran a general store, and I helped out until I left when I was 16. They were good people, and I don't think they really agreed with what was happening. They weren't the kind of people that fell in with religious fervor. But they understood the purpose for it, understood the purpose it served the community, and they participated in it, even if it was unwillingly. The celebration of Lady Eostre was not as old as the village itself, but almost. On Easter Sunday, 12 of the town's children were pushed from their homes and led into the square in the middle of town. Their ages were between 6 and 15, and the event was always preceded by merriment before the night itself. There was a carnival that week. Feasts were eaten, gifts were given, and then the night that everyone dreaded inevitably came. I don't remember much about those nights. I remember the underlying dread I felt as I sat in my room, the silent tears I cried without knowing why, and the relief I felt when I'd awoken the next morning to find that it was daylight again. That and the screams. I still hear the screams sometimes when the nightmares come. To understand why this happens, you'd first have to understand Our Lady. The Lady Eostre was once a hallowed deity. She was the goddess of dawn, and the rays she brought had nourished the land for the founders of our region. Eostre had shown them where to go, shown them where to plant, and the bountiful harvest made the townspeople rich and the cities prosper. They praised her and her generosity, praised her for her gifts, but she told them too late that there was a price. You see, she hadn't told them what else lay in that valley. There's a cave near Father's Glen, a huge dank maw that breeds nothing but shadows and pain. Those who go in never come out, and it's where the children of Eostre reside. Legend says that once they were birds, creatures of the wind who were free to fly as they would, but Eostre turned them into hares, an animal more fitting for a season of fertility and growth. The hares were pleased with this. Now they were free to explore the land as they had once explored above, but over time, they grew to hate the children of men, who often hunted them and their smaller cousins. When the people moved into the valley, they began to hunt the rabbits for food, which infuriated the hares. The valley was said to be thick with rabbits and hares at one point, but the humans were in for a surprise as they filled their stew pots. The children of Eostre, the hares, began to come out at night and hunt the men, and many, hares and humans, died as a result. The ensuing skirmishes were good for no one, and Eostre stepped in. In her infinite wisdom, she brokered a trade, a contest of sorts. If you would hunt the humans, then give them the same chance they have given you. For one night, the weakest of them will hide and run from sunset to sunrise, and any you catch will be your prize. Once a year, you will send 12 of your young ones, one for each month that you have hunted my hares, and they will search for them. If they find them, they may take them back to their cave. Those who they do not find will go free. For every other night, my hares will remain below the ground, never to hunt a human under my protection. This is my decree, and all shall abide. And so it has been from that day on. I was chosen only once to participate in the festival. The town wasn't huge, maybe 30 or 40 children of the desired age at any given time, and it wasn't uncommon for a name to come out of the kettle more than once. My friend Maria was chosen 4 times, but managed to hide until dawn on all but the last time. A sibling could go in your place, and sometimes they did. I remember one year that a boy named Elaine had went in his sister's place and was supposed to have killed 3 of the hares before they got him. I never saw the bodies. Everything was cleaned up as it always was when we came out the next day. Most years, I just sat in my room with the doors and windows locked as I cried into my arm and tried not to listen to the children below as they screamed. Most years, only a few lucky kids came back. I was fortunate enough to come back the time I was selected. I suppose I wouldn't be telling you this story otherwise, would I? I was 8 when I went out to do my duty, as my mother put it. I was scared, but part of me just couldn't believe that I would die or never come back. I was young, and all children believe themselves to be immortal. Hell, even the thought of rabbits coming to get me made me giggle. I could just imagine little bunnies with torches and pitchforks, hopping along as they tried to catch a bunch of terrified children. Even as the nun told us about it in the local school, I giggled a little, earning myself a smack with a ruler for my insolence. You won't think it's so funny when you're in the streets some night and they come for you. I saw my father when my name was drawn, and I couldn't understand his terror. I had heard the screams, of course, but I believed they were just people putting on. I knew that people got killed, but I didn't really believe it. Why would my parents send me out to do something that would get me killed? My parents loved me, and I knew they wouldn't want me to come to harm. I was confident that this was just some Father Christmas or Tooth Fairy sort of thing. Just a bit of harmless hogwash for children. I had never actually known any of the children that didn't return, so it was like nothing had changed from year to year. How small my world was, and how frightening it seems now that I was so naive. So I sat at the feasts, played the games, enjoyed myself that week. I saw some of the other children who'd been chosen, and while some looked scared, others clearly didn't grasp what was in store for them either. We joked about rabbit hunts and bringing carrots to feed the bunnies. We all laughed and talked about how brave we would be, but none of us really understood what was about to happen. Then came Sunday night, and I think it all became real to me. My mother called me into the kitchen, just as the sun began to sparkle at the edge of the horizon. She presented me with some gifts for tonight. She had bought a pair of soft black pants and a very tight shirt. She put a pair of soft shoes on my feet, and I could feel their delicate material hug me gratefully. Listen closely, because what I tell you might save your life. On the night I was chosen to take part, I hid in the horse shed near the drawbridge. The smell of the hay seemed to make me harder to find. If you bury yourself deep in the stack, you should be safe until morning. Don't try to fight them. Don't be careless or brash. Just run and hide and survive. I love you. Your father loves you. And we wish there was any other way but this one. We wish there was some way to help you, my father said, suddenly coming from his study and startling me. But this is all we can offer you. Good luck. We hope to see you in the morning. Then they hugged me, both of them enveloping me in their shared embrace, before leading me to the door and showing me out into the semi-darkness. I walked to the square, unafraid as the gaslights flared cheerfully. Why should I be afraid? This was my home. I had ran over these streets with my friends. We had played by the fountain in the square. We had gone to the market and bought candy and toys with our allowance. And we had gossiped and giggled as we walked to school. Nothing here could hurt us. Nothing here could threaten us, as the warm stones of our hometown wrapped us in a cocoon of safety. This was just a game for grown-ups to play, and it would prove as hollow as the stories of the boogeyman or the goblins who came to take away naughty children. I could see the others as they flitted into the square, but they were not quite as chatty as they had been earlier. As the sun set, casting the last of its light on the town, we heard the bell toll and saw the mayor come out onto the balcony that overlooked the square. He looked resplendent in his long coat, his shoes with the buckles gleaming in the dancing torchlight, as he stared down at us from his high perch. He looked sorry to see us here, but resolute in his decision. He would carry this out, then he would step back inside, so we didn't have to watch the results of his actions. We give thanks to Eostre for a beautiful harvest, for the valley that we live in, and for the gifts that she has given us generations ago. We ask her to watch over these little ones as they hide from her children. May she take pity on them and let them come home again. He said more, going on for what felt like hours, but my head had turned from him as I heard a noise. It was the harsh flop of a too large foot, the echoing thump of heavy footsteps, and as I looked, I saw them. There were 3 of them, all tall and lithe, with arms and legs too long to be human. They didn't so much walk as they galumphed, as if walking on 2 legs was never something they would become used to. As the mayor droned on, I saw one of them become too eager and step close to the edge of the alley they were hiding in. Its fur was snowy white, a speckling of brown making it look as though it had freckles on its chest and nose. Around its neck and across its shoulders, to my surprise, I could see feathers. and I remembered suddenly that they had once been birds. Its mouth had a distinctly beakish look to it, and I felt cold dread creep into me as this creature hulked at the ready. It held a delicate-looking flint knife in its too large hand, and my humor at the thought of being hunted by bunnies was gone now. These were no cute little hopping creatures you sometimes saw in the glen. These were like the trolls and goblins we were told stories about, old and mean and utterly devoid of human kindness. As the sun sets, I beg you all to flee. Go now, before they're set loose by that ancient promise. Some of the others had seen them too, and I was suddenly aware that the press around me was thinning. Children of all ages were running, fleeing into the corridors and alleys we all knew so well. I was running too, leaving behind the few who were still gaping up at the mayor as he moved away. They would give me time to run as the creatures found them first. Their screams were high and terrified, but mercifully short. I ran for the stables, just like Mother had told me to, but the hares didn't stay in the square for long. The streets echoed with those strange hopping thuds, and I could hear them as they caught others. Children were easy to track. They wept, their feet thudded loudly, their breathing was much too deep, and the hares seemed to locate them easily as I ran for my life. Unlike the others, my shoes seemed to whisper over the cobbles. They were soft, hugging my feet like a second skin. And though the night was breezy, I never heard so much as a flap from my clothes. I was like a shadow as I traveled the streets of my home, and when I saw the bridge looming up in the distance, I put on an extra burst of speed. When I heard the flapping, galumphing sound of those two wide feet, though, I threw myself against a nearby wall and stayed as quiet as possible. I could hear it as its feet slapped at the cobblestones, its nose twitching as it tasted air that likely stank of humanity. The sounds of its twitching nose made my skin crawl, the noises akin to bugs that had nested under a loose cobble. I put a hand over my mouth as my fearful breathing threatened to give me away. I couldn't tell how long I stood there. Time seemed to creep by as the creature looked and sniffed. Fear time is always different than actual time, and the stretch of seconds can seem to take decades in that moment of extreme terror. Then, mercifully, he left, and I ran like the rabbit I had become for the stables. The stables were empty, the horses taken elsewhere, but the hay trough still remained. I plunged into the itchy depths, making myself into a ball as I shuddered at the bottom of the pile. The clothes my mother had given me were long-sleeved and long-legged, so I had only to cover my face so the itchy depths wouldn't give me away. The scent of hay was strong, and the dust that coated me made me stifle a sneeze. I had to be silent. I couldn't do anything to give myself away. I lay at the bottom of that trough for hours, my adrenaline running high and my ears straining for the smallest sound. I heard them when they came in the first time. There had to be at least two of them, their feet slapping at the cobbles as they searched the stalls. I heard them turn over tubs, open closets that were only occupied by horse tack, and grumble in their strange language when they found nothing. When one of them came towards the hay trough, I thought I was done for. It dug through the hay, pulling handfuls away as it searched, and I pressed myself as flat as I could against the bottom. I had to stuff my fist in my mouth, careful not to rustle the hay, for fear that I would be given away by a scream as the creature got closer and closer to finding me. My fist was sweaty, the taste of hay and dust likely to choke me, but I held absolutely still as it threatened to uncover my hiding spot. When it sneezed, the dust getting into its nose, I almost sighed in relief. It scooped out a few more handfuls before stopping, sneezing again as it moved away. Those deep thumps took it out of the horse stall, and I was left to shiver and shake as my adrenaline coursed freshly through me. Somehow, I couldn't have told you how at the time, as the adrenaline ebbed off, I fell asleep at the bottom of the trough. When I awoke, it was daytime, and the night of terror was at an end. My mother found me, hay still clinging to me as I walked towards home. She pulled me close and kissed my hair, thanking Eostre for my safe return. Given that Eostre was responsible for what had happened last night, it seemed silly to thank her. That night was 15 years ago, and I've since moved from my small rural town. Hamburg makes the place I was born look like a dirt track, and after college I found work easily as the foreman of a textile mill. My parents call me once a week, sending letters in this age of email instead of getting with the times. I have settled down now, had a child of my own, and our conversations always seem to turn to when they will get to meet their grandson. My answer is always the same: when you come to Hamburg to see him. After all that I've witnessed in that place, after sitting in my room for 8 years with the knowledge of what was going on outside those walls, I'll be damned if I'll let my son anywhere close to those damned Warrens and those snuffling monstrosities. So when you hear about the resurrection, as you bite the ears off your chocolate bunny, count yourself lucky that you live without the fear that was such a big part of my childhood. Remember that somewhere, there's a bunny that would love nothing more than to bite the ears off of you. It felt like such a harmless resolution. Everyone makes them, after all. I simply wanted a new me for the new year. Last year had been a joke in every sense of the word. With quarantine, we had been locked down inside for months. The city nearly shut down completely. But we had all been a little hopeful at the beginning that we could use this time to our advantage. I would use it to better myself. I'd learn a new skill. I'd write my book. I'd never go back to my crappy job again. In that time of uncertainty, we all settled in with high hopes of coming out with something better than we'd started. Turns out, I only managed one of those things. I would never go back to my crappy job because I was laid off halfway through the year. I spent the next 6 months wallowing in self-pity, watching Netflix and adding quarantine weight to my belt. My exercise plan went by the wayside. My plans to better myself didn't seem to matter, and as my wife started her new job at the grocery store, her job had also let her go, I settled into depression like a crab in its shell. As I sat on the couch, one show after another rolling past, I saw little reason to do much of anything. When Christmas rolled around, I realized it had been 9 months since I'd done anything of value, and that was when the depression set in. I spent Christmas morning in a funk, sitting in my sweatpants and watching our kids open their meager gifts. My wife sat in the armchair opposite me, looking tired but happy with the gifts she had gotten them. She'd bought everything, paid for everything, because I was too lazy and unmotivated to do much of anything. Every now and then, I would catch these little looks from her, little disappointed looks tinged with sadness. All I could do was wallow in my sadness, though, not sure what I could do to change it. When New Year's came, I just stayed in bed. I didn't feel worthy to join the others for their midnight toasts or their energetic countdowns. As I heard them count down, I closed my eyes and felt myself make more of a wish than a resolution. 5, I wanted a new me for the new year. 4, a better me. 3, for them. 2, someone they could be proud of. 1, someone who wouldn't let them down. Happy New Year! I dozed off to the sound of them ringing in the new year, hoping I would awake to find that I'd found the strength to make my resolution a reality. I woke up to the smell of eggs and bacon, pancakes and syrup, and hearty laughter from downstairs. They had started breakfast without me. The first breakfast of the year was a tradition of ours. Why wouldn't they? I hadn't exactly been there the last few months. Why would now be any different? Why not now? Why not make good on my resolution? I got dressed in something other than sweatpants and came downstairs to the laughter of my family. Someone was sitting at the head of the table, though, telling a story that had all of them in stitches, and I felt a little miffed as I came to the foot of the stairs. Who was this guy? He sounded a little familiar, but I couldn't place him right away. They hadn't woken me up to eat, and now there was some stranger in my house. What the hell was going on? Lisa, why didn't you tell me we had company? But Lisa said nothing. She had eyes only for this charismatic stranger who was sitting in my chair. Brad? Janet? Did anyone save me any pancakes? I'm as hungry as... So glad you woke up to make these pancakes this morning, dear, Lisa said, raising her orange juice glass to the man at the head of the table. What can I say? The guy said, and as I moved around to confront him, I took a step back in surprise.
I was as hungry as a bear this morning. It was me. I was sitting at the head of the table. I was still the same as I was now, but I looked different somehow. My face was shaved, my hair was cut down from the greasy tangles it was now, and I had dressed in some normal clothes. I was wearing an apron, smudged with flour and speckled with grease. More than that, though, I seemed to exude a healthy glow. I was a mess, but I could get better. I was filled with an energy that let people know I was changed. I was full of vigor, full of life, full of pep. I kept yelling at them as they ate, trying to get someone's attention, but they all just kept eating, kept laughing, kept living as though I didn't exist. I made a joke then, my family's laughter the backdrop for the screams that came ripping up my throat as I slowly lost my mind. When he picked up their plates and walked them to the kitchen, I followed him. I kept jabbering at the back of his head, the catharsis the only thing that mattered now. I asked him what the hell he thought he was doing. I yelled at him to get out of my house and leave my family alone, and to stop pretending to be me. He stood there, washing dishes as I screamed at him, and when I was done, he just laughed. "When are you gonna wake up? I'm you now," he said, turning around to look at me, my own face smiling back in the face of my confusion, "and I have no intention of going anywhere." I took a step away from him, my anger turning to confusion. What are you?" I gasped, backing into the counter as I tried to get away from this strange homunculus. "I'm you, the best you, and soon I'll be the only you." I stayed for about a month just to watch over them, just to watch him. He was the perfect husband, though, the perfect father, the perfect man. He went to my son's Little League games. He went to my daughter's band recitals. He remembered my wife's birthday, remembered her favorite food, and he made time for her every day. He got out and found a job working at a warehouse, and after a month they talked about making him an assistant manager. He cooked dinners and read bedtime stories, and was the husband and father that my family deserved. And I was there to watch it all as my family gathered around him and became the focal point once again. After a month of living like a ghost in my own house, I left and never looked back. I began to walk one day and just didn't stop for a while. I expected to disappear, to stop existing, but I found that the opposite was true. The farther I walked, the more I began to feel alive again. I hadn't noticed while I'd been watching my family live with this strange man, but I hadn't felt the urge to eat or drink that whole time. The farther I moved from my house, the more I realized I was becoming hungrier and thirstier. I had brought my wallet with me out of habit, and the cheeseburger and fries I bought tasted heavenly. I was able to use my debit card and my credit card for a little while, but after a few months they stopped working, and I was forced to work odd jobs in order to feed and clothe myself. By some stroke of luck, I had purchased some things I would need to survive in my new homeless lifestyle before my credit card was turned off. It wasn't much, but it helped me get far enough away from my old home that people could see me again. It's proximity that seemed to trigger it. At least that's what Malcolm thinks. Sorry, I got a little ahead of myself there. About 6 months ago, a year into my journey, I met a homeless guy at a soup kitchen, and we started talking about our past lives. I told him how I'd left my family, making it sound like my wife had left me for another man, but he just smiled and shook his head. He said he had a similar story, his wife leaving him for someone else, but it wasn't just anyone. She left me for another me, just like your wife. I was speechless, but when I asked how he could know that, he told me a very familiar story. Malcolm had been a company man. He had worked long hours, holidays, birthdays, missing most of the important memories from his child's lives. One of those special events was a particular vacation where his son had drowned while he was at a board meeting. His wife and daughters were distraught. John had been the baby of his family, and they had all doted on him. But Malcolm had only thrown himself harder into his work to hide his grief. One night, New Year's Eve actually, his wife had come to him and said that she felt like she was in a shell of a marriage and that she needed a partner more than a bank account. I stood looking down from my office on the 12th floor and let my grief wash over me at last. I wished for a better me, for the man my wife deserved, and I suppose I got it. When I woke up at my desk the next day, I was like Ebenezer Scrooge after the ghosts had come to visit him. I rushed home, wanting to apologize for never being there for them, but I was already there. I was sitting at the table. I was talking with them and telling them that I was going to turn over a new leaf. And when I saw myself looking through the window, I just smiled at me with the biggest shit-eating grin I could muster. Malcolm, the new Malcolm, had sold his shares of the company, giving ownership to the board, and left a rich man. He had taken Malcolm's family away, moving somewhere he could retire and show them the attention they deserved. Malcolm had never seen them again. He had haunted his empty house for a few months, unsure of where they had gone, but eventually the cops had come and found him squatting there. They could see me again, now that my family was gone, and they rousted me from the house. I told them who I was, but they just laughed at me and told me to keep dreaming. I showed them my ID, my credit cards, and they threw me in jail, believing I was a thief. I spent 3 years in prison for petty theft before getting out and hitting the road. That was 20 years ago, and I've been on the move ever since. I travel with Malcolm now. We found 2 others since we set out, too. They seem drawn to us somehow. Our shared grief and sense of strangeness seems to call to them. They both have similar stories, similar wishes, and it seems that their wishes also came true. So give some thought before you wish for a new self in the new year. Your new self may just make your old self obsolete.
Lisa saw him sitting on the back porch, his axe laid across his lap. "Tom?" she asked, coming up behind him to put a hand on his shoulder. Matt nodded, glancing over as their baby girl squirmed in Lisa's arms. Sarah was growing fast, 3 months old now, and it was hard for Matt to imagine life without her. She was his first child, and his life had changed so much since her birth. The money had finally come through. The bank had decided they were stable enough to receive the loan they needed. The farm was on the verge of finally becoming what it had once been. Matt was ready to transition from the state's largest turkey farm to the state's largest dairy farm and cattle ranch. Old Tom, the last of the family's turkeys, was all that was left of that legacy. Old Tom stood at the edge of the fence, looking at the new cleared field and the newly constructed cow sheds that had taken the place of the long turkey sheds that had once graced the land. He'd been standing there for days, watching the direction the trucks had taken his last few children, and Matt was a little worried about him. Old Tom hadn't eaten, hadn't drunk any water, and hadn't moved for nearly 3 days. That's why Matt was sitting out here now, trying to muster the courage to do what had to be done. Lisa kissed the top of his head and took Sarah inside, leaving him with his thoughts. Matt imagined that Old Tom knew these were his last few days. Old Tom had been with the family for years. When Matt's grandpa had died, the farm had been on the verge of bankruptcy. It had been a cattle ranch then. They had supplied beef to many of the surrounding towns, had signed a lucrative contract with the local schools to supply fresh beef, but as good as the times were, they had turned in a matter of months. Disease spread through the cows, killing them and making the meat worthless. The land had been covered in rotting corpses of their prized cows, and Matt's grandpa had slipped away in the night from some unknown illness. His son, Matt's father, had told him that his granddad had been a strapping man at 6 feet, a mountain of muscle, but the disease had shriveled him like a grape and aged him well before his time. No one knew what it was or where it had come from, but it had killed him just as quickly as the cows, and soon all that Matt's dad had was a farm of corpses. That was when Old Tom had come. Matt's dad had been standing in the field one morning, contemplating just selling the farm so he could be done with the place, when he saw 3 turkeys come wandering up out of the woods. They had come through the field and made a beeline for him, and his dad couldn't believe his luck. He had reached for his rifle, meaning to kill them and take them home for supper, but the middle turkey had fixed him with such a withering look that he couldn't even summon the strength to pull the trigger. All 3 had wandered right past him, taking up residence in the barn, and his dad had let them stay. Maybe he thought he'd kill them tomorrow and have a meal then. They were in the barn, and they clearly weren't going anywhere. The next day, though, his father discovered a surprise. Both hens had laid eggs in the barn, with one nest near the gate and one near the back. Dad said that old Tom had looked at him, and something inside had told him that the eggs near the door were for him. That same feeling also told him that if he tried to collect the ones near the back, he'd be in for a fight. Dad had left both sets. He had devised a plan the night before, a plan involving the turkeys that had roosted in the barn, and the addition of young turkeys would help it move along greatly. Dad fed them and housed them in the barn, to his wife's ire. They had enough to worry about with a failing farm and her 6 months pregnant with Matt. His dad stood firm, though, that the turkeys would be good to have. About a month later, and they had some little turkeys, and Matt's mom had begun to see the value in the plan. Matt's dad had always marveled at how they had grown. They needed only minimal attention, and grew much larger than any other turkey he'd ever seen. They ate up the food he gave them, and seemed to grow huge on what amounted to scraps. 5 months after they hatched, Dad had taken 10 toms to the county fair. Some of them had won prizes, but all of them had been sold. He'd come home with no turkeys, but he'd made enough money to get them by for a while. Every year after that, there had been 10 to 20 turkeys waiting to go to market several times a year. The ones he were to take were always set away from the rest of the turkey family, who had taken over the old barn, and Matt's father was always careful to leave a selection of hens behind. Old Tom, it seemed, was better at population control than his dad was, though. Old Tom allowed him to cull his herd, and in exchange he received a safe place to stay, and more food than he strictly needed. Old Tom made the farm profitable. Hell, he made it a household name within the state, and a turkey might as well be the family crest for Matt's house. Dad had warned Matt on his deathbed, though, not to do what he was planning. "You can't go back, son. Turkeys are our legacy, and so shall they remain." Matt had placated him, but he had already set things into motion that couldn't be undone. Besides, he was tired of turkeys. It was time for a new era on his farm. It was time to make some sacrifices. He got up and walked towards the old turkey. Old Tom didn't move. He was a trusting sort, and he let Matt move right up to the fence so he could follow the old turkey's gaze. His sight line ran off into the field, towards the road where the Sanderson farm trucks had taken his kin. Matt shook his head as he thought about it. That had been a fight. Tom's brood had swollen to fill the other 3 sheds, and 3 more had been built just for him and his children. Half of those born were culled and sent out to take their place in the truck every cycle. However, the turkeys in the back of the barn had become almost like royalty. They lived untouched for generations, and they had been in no hurry to give up their lives. They had taken the invasion of their home very badly. The men who had come to get them had worn long gloves and leather smocks, but more than a few of them had left with cuts on their faces and long slashes on their gloves. The turkeys that were this cycle's sacrifice, 500 docile birds, had walked onto the truck as though hypnotized. When the men returned for the rest, though, the turkeys still in the barn had looked at the men with distrust. They had fought, swooping down on the men, fighting them with surprising ferocity. By the end of the day, they had loaded close to 1,000 birds in the back of the truck and just taken them away. Matt had assumed that old Tom had been among them, but then he'd recognized the white head and the blood-red wattle of the ancient bird as it stared through the fence. One of the men had offered to go get him, but Matt had refused. Old Tom was his, and he would let the turkey live until the time came for him to grace their table this Thanksgiving. "Sorry, old fella. Times are changing. I'm moving away from turkeys. I'm moving up in the world. It's time for a change. It's time for your legacy to end." The turkey turned its head towards Matt, making him feel a little sillier for talking to the bird. And that's when he heard a hateful voice crawl across his mind. "My legacy may end, but it won't end alone." Matt stared at the turkey, his mouth hanging open a little. What the hell was that? Was he losing his mind? He had been through a lot of stress lately, designating grazeland and fixing up the old barns, but not enough to hear a freaking turkey talk. Matt looked around suddenly, wondering if someone was goofing with him, but it was just the Methuselah of a turkey, and he. Did you just... "Yes," old Tom said in his head, turning back to the field. "Just as I did to your father when we first met. I doubt he told you. He thought he was mad. You sent my children away
condemned my hens to a slow death in cages, but it needn't end like this. I can call more hens. I can sire more turkeys. The cycle can continue. Your family name can once again be known for the flesh of my people, and I will continue to live."
Matt thought about it. The turkey trade had been good for him. It had gotten him through some hard times. He could do both. He could have cows, bulls, and turkeys. He could split the sheds. They could share the farm. He could keep stepping in shit every morning and having dreams where he was 5 years old with a bucket of feed and a swarm of skeletal turkeys swarming around him before his dad had picked him up. Matt could stop having dreams about looking down and seeing their hateful little eyes as they stared up at him. He could stop the dreams where he found his daughter's corpse picked clean in the shed while his hateful old bird here stood nearby and looked on placidly. He could stop all that with just a swing of his axe, and he meant to. "I don't think so," Matt said, hefting the axe as he prepared to swing. Tom stuck out his neck, looking at him with those hate-filled eyes.
"Then go ahead. Doom yourself forever."
The sound of the axe coming down would haunt Matt for the rest of his life, but he slept like a baby that night. It would be the last peaceful sleep that he ever had. The sound of people knocking woke him up the next day. Matt looked at the clock and was horrified to discover that it was almost 10 o'clock. Lisa came groggily awake, looking around frantically as she asked why he hadn't woken her up earlier. Matt shrugged. They had never needed to set an alarm. They had always been awakened at 5 a.m. to... They both tore off towards the nursery, but Matt could already guess what they would find. Sarah was missing, her window hanging open and her bassinet empty except for a scattering of feathers. Lisa didn't notice the feathers, but Matt sure did. You didn't raise turkeys for as long as Matt did without being able to recognize turkey feathers. Matt nearly bowled his in-laws over as he charged through the door and made his way towards the old turkey barn. His father-in-law huffed angrily, but his brother-in-law turned to keep pace with him. He had a nose for these sorts of things, and he could tell that something was wrong. He and Matt had been friends long before he'd married his sister, and he knew at once that Matt was agitated. They ran to the turkey barn, the one Matt had always seen old Tom sleep in, but it was empty. Of course it was empty. All the turkeys were gone now. Matt had gotten rid of them before he killed the last one yesterday. Matt didn't know why he had thought they would find her in here. He and Lisa had spent the evening cleaning and preparing the turkey they had killed. It was Thanksgiving, after all. That was why Matt had sold all the turkeys in the first place. Sanderson Farms had paid him a rather hefty sum for that many birds, and it had made their transaction with the bank all the smoother. Old Tom, Matt had decided, should die here, where he had lived most of his life. He would be the family's Thanksgiving meal this year. His final act would be to feed the family that he had helped elevate. They had put his corpse in the oven before going to bed, and Matt had thought fondly that this would be the last turkey he'd ever see outside of a grocery store. When the scream cut across the yard, Matt knew where he should have started his search. He could hear Lisa screaming hysterically, her cry high and mournful. It sounded like they had found Sarah. When Matt came into the farmhouse, Lisa was sobbing on the dining room floor. Matt had never seen her cry like that, and her sorrow shook her whole body. Her eyes were fixed on his, and Matt saw the look of intense confusion and mistrust. What had she seen? Why was she looking at him like that? Where had they found Sarah? Matt got his answer when he walked into the dining room. His mother-in-law was still holding the carving knife. His father-in-law was clutching his chest in the corner as a piece of meat lay on the floor in front of him. The turkey sat in the middle of the table, pristine, save for the slice on the left side. Matt saw the source of the panic as it protruded from the cavity, and he felt certain that he would vomit right there in his mother's once pristine kitchen. The turkey sat on the table that so many of his mother's Thanksgiving turkeys had graced throughout his childhood. The turkey that sat there now profaned her old farm table. Sticking from the cavity in the turkey was a tiny arm. Its flesh had been browned and crisped, its skin marred slightly by the carving knife, but Matt knew who it must be.
His legs unhinged, and he fell against the china cabinet, the dishes inside clattering angrily as Matt looked at that arm. It swam before his eyes as his mind tried to unhinge, and Matt passed out amidst the shrieking of his wife and the cries of her family. He woke up on the couch, with the police standing over him. Lisa had needed to be taken to the hospital, her shrieking having devolved into a catatonic state. The police were very interested in knowing how Matt's 3-month-old daughter had gotten cooked into a turkey, and how no one had any clue how it had happened. They took him down to the station and asked him question after question after question. They were certain he had done it, but they didn't understand why. Hell, Matt didn't fully understand why at the time. He still didn't understand why, as he sat in the living room of his childhood home. He'd been drinking since they'd released him. He tipped the whiskey bottle and let the delicious fire fill his mouth as he tried to put out the fire in his guts. He was good and drunk as he watched the field fall into darkness. Matt wasn't sure he'd be alive in the morning to see the sun come up over them. There was a gun in his other hand, but it wasn't for him. Matt had been watching the field, watching it darken, and he believed he could see something moving out there. Something was massing in that barren field, cloaked in shadows, but still very real. There were eyes in the field, beady red eyes filled with a hatred that Matt knew all too well. Hadn't he seen those eyes as a child? Hadn't his father snatched him away before they could have him? Well, it looked like they might have him after all. A huge something blocked out the moon as it came through the screen door. Matt suspected that it might be old Tom come to end his legacy. He supposed he couldn't have Matt's legacy continue in some other way. Matt supposed what he was thankful for was that he was too drunk and numb to care what corner of hell these turkeys were about to drag him off to.
I knew there was no way I could have seen him, but I could swear I saw my old dog, Blue, standing near the fence of Sanders' farm. I work out of town, the town I grew up in being pretty tiny, and I have to pass Sanders' farm anytime I come home from work. Sanders' farm has been a landmark since before I was born, and it grows most of the produce for town. Herschel Sanders runs a very successful produce stand in town, and sells crops to grocery stores all over the state. He's a bit of a local celebrity, and he seems to be the only person in town doing well for himself besides Cotton's Antiques. He also owned the farm my parents were supposed to have dropped Blue off to when I was a kid. Blue had been a good dog, a great companion for a kid my age, but maybe a little too rambunctious for my parents' liking. He'd been a mutt with pointy ears, a thick coat of soft brown fur, and a pair of green, inquisitive eyes that never seemed to get tired of darting around for something to chase or catch. I loved him, but for 2 adults in a small house, we lived in an apartment at the time, he must have been a nightmare. The day he bit Tommy was probably one of the worst days I remember, so, of course, it was indelibly etched in my memory forever. Tommy was a lot older than me or my friends. He was 12, and we all lived in fear of him. Whenever he strode onto the little playground area off the apartment complex, 5'8" and broad in the chest, we all usually left to go play somewhere else. Unfortunately, on that day, I was playing alone on the basketball court, and didn't have time to escape. I'd been shooting baskets. I wanted to join the elementary school basketball league next year, so I wanted to get good. That's when Tommy came striding up. Blue was panting about good-naturedly, but looked up when he saw Tommy coming. He was always alone, never having any chums to play around with, and that should have been a red flag to any adult that had been watching. Even the most brutal of children have someone to pal around with, but Tommy was too antisocial and stupid mean for even other bullies to accept. "What you doing, sissy?" he asked, dragging out his limited insults he reserved for sissies or babies. I told him I was just shooting baskets, and he sneered like that was the silliest thing he'd ever heard. "That's not how you get better, stupid. Why don't you play me one-on-one? That'll get you better quicker." I agreed, thinking maybe he had decided to be friendlier. Nothing could have been further from the truth. The game started out with him taking the ball from me and scoring point after point. I was smaller than him, so it was easy for him to steal the ball from me and rack up points while I stumbled around. After a while, I started developing some strategies to get around him, though, and I started making some points on my own. Before I knew it, we were nearly tied, and this was unacceptable to Tommy. The game had been dirty before, but now it was downright brutal. The first time he pushed me, I heard Blue growl a warning. The second time he pushed me, I heard Blue snarl at him. On the third time, his fist coming down to crack me on the side of the head, I heard him yell as Blue sank his teeth into Tommy's backside. Tommy cried out, telling me to get my dog off him. I was shocked. I'd never seen Blue bite anyone. He hung onto the back of his jeans, worrying at him, as Tommy ran off the blacktop towards his house. He let him go as his sneakers left the court, and I laughed about it then, Blue grinning his doggy grin as he came back to rub against my hand. When the police arrived at my house later that day, I didn't think it was so funny. They told us that Tommy's parents had reported a dog bite. Specifically, they had reported that Blue had bitten their son, and now the police had come to take him away. I told them my side of the story, all the while clutching Blue around the neck, but it didn't seem to make any difference to them. A dog had bit, and now he had to be put down. I think Dad saw that I was getting really upset, because he agreed to take Blue to the police station and said he wouldn't let them put him to sleep unless I got to say goodbye. This soothed me a little, but I was still pretty upset as I watched my dog walk away for the last time. When Dad came back, it was already nighttime, but he seemed a little happier. He told me that he had come to an understanding with the police officers, and they had let him drop Blue off at Sanders' farm. Dad said that Mr. Sanders usually took in troubled dogs, or dogs that were going to be put down, and let them work on his farm as farm dogs. That way, Blue could live there, and he wouldn't have to be put to sleep. He'll have all kinds of room to run around, much more room than this little apartment, and he'll be happy, Dad had said. I was ecstatic. I was sad that Blue couldn't live with us anymore, but at least the police wouldn't have to put him to sleep. I asked Dad if we could go visit him sometime, to see how he was doing, and Dad said we would see. I went to bed that night and dreamed about Blue as he ran on the farm, herding sheep and running off crows and enjoying his life now that he had a lot of space to play in. I asked Dad a few times if we could go see Blue, but it never seemed to be a good time. Dad always said things like he didn't want to distract him while he was at work, or he didn't want to make it hard for him to settle in by reminding him about his old family. I understood these things. They made sense, but I really wanted to see Blue again. I remember asking a handful of times, but like most kids, my attention span was pretty limited. I got a new game console that year for Christmas. I made the basketball team, so I had to practice almost every day. I was getting ready to go to middle school, so I was a little worried about that. And after a while, I just sort of forgot about Blue. I never really forgot about him. I still thought about him sometimes, in that vague way that kids often do, but I just stopped asking to go see him. Eventually, I guess I stopped thinking about him. Until today, when I saw him on the fence, I hadn't honestly thought about him in years. I was heading to dinner with my parents after work, so I figured I'd let them know what I'd seen. They might like knowing that Blue was okay, and that he was still living a good life. Mom opened the door for me when I knocked, and invited me to help finish fixing dinner. As I chopped vegetables for a salad, I told her what I'd seen, but she didn't seem to understand. The chunk of the knife seemed soothing as it cut the vegetables, and I told her that I'd seen Blue running around the farm where we'd left him. She still seemed a little confused, not really understanding what I was talking about, and when Dad came in, I told him as well. Dad didn't seem confused at all, though. Quite the contrary, he looked a little scared. You saw Blue at Sanders' farm? Yeah, just where you said you dropped him off. He looked really happy. He was running around, chasing birds, and living his best life. He looked up when I drove past and almost seemed to recognize me. I was thinking that I might go visit him, see if he's still... Kid, Dad stated, cutting me off. That's impossible. I guess you're right, I said, thinking it over as we talked about it. Blue would have to be 20 years old by now. Maybe it's one of his puppies. It looks just like him. I might stop by anyway, see if maybe Mr. Sanders will sell me one of Blue's puppies. It would be nice to have a reminder of old Blue around the apartment. My dad sat down heavily, and that made me look up at him with real worry. He seemed like he was debating something, or maybe having a hard time accepting something. I was worried for a minute that he might be having a heart attack. He'd had one last year, and after that his heart hadn't exactly been stable. Instead, he just looked up at me like he might have seen a ghost or something. "That's not possible, because Blue is dead." I looked at him in shock. "How do you know? Did Mr. Sanders tell you when He didn't have to. Blue died the night I took him to the police station. We put him down." My head spun a little. Had they been lying to me this whole time? Dad had told me he'd taken Blue to the farm. He had stuck to that story till eventually I forgot. Had he just been telling me a lie to stop me from being upset? Why had he told me about taking Blue to the farm at all? "Sit down. I think it's time I tell you the truth. It's the truth you may have to face yourself one day, so it's best you hear it now." I sat down, keeping a close eye on my old man, who suddenly seemed less trustworthy than he had a few minutes ago. People in this town always say that they're taking their dogs to the farm. It's been a tradition for at least as long as I can remember. My own dad told me he was taking my dog Scout to Sanders' farm when he got too old and too sick. He said that Scout could run and play for as long as he wanted, and the country air would do him some good. My daddy had never lied to me before, at least not that I knew of, and I was happy that Scout could live somewhere where he could get better. He was old and really sick. I wasn't quite ready to say goodbye to him yet, though. Daddy said we could visit him, but we never did. Eventually, just like you, I kind of forgot about him and went on with my life. I sat in silence, not really sure what to make of all this. So Granddad had lied as well, but this seemed to be a generational lie. Why did so many people use Sanders' farm as a place to leave their dogs? Was it a convenient lie? Or was there more to it? Why did you lie to me?" I asked, still not happy about being misled. "Because I knew that Blue was going to be killed, and I knew that you weren't ready to lose him. Taking him to the farm was just something people tell kids around here. I'd imagine that you have a lot of friends who've had their dogs taken to Sanders' farm over the years. But why? What's the point of it all?" Dad seemed to think about this, weighing his options before settling on, "You'll understand when you're older, when you have kids of your own. Sanders' farm is an important place in this community for many reasons, some of them not quite known even to the people who use it." I didn't end up staying for dinner. I left, despite my mother's protests, and drove home. I don't know why, but I was just so irrationally mad about being lied to. I realized, of course, that my parents had lied like this before. I've lived with the Easter Bunny, the Tooth Fairy, Santa Claus, and even a monster that lived in the basement named Mr. Giles, who would get you if you came downstairs after bedtime. They all turned out to be fake, of course. They were lies they told, but lies that they told gently, and only to add magic to my childhood or keep me from doing foolish things. I could understand those lies, but not this one. This one felt different. This one felt personal. I flopped onto the couch when I got home, and John paused his game as he glanced over at me. "What's wrong, babe? You look upset." "It's nothing," I lied, looking away before finally spilling the whole sad story. I was in tears by the end, my boyfriend holding my hands and patting them gently. He'd grown up here too, and had known my parents only slightly less time than I had. He often gave me some perspective on what was going on, and was my voice of reason in many things. "I'm sure your dad had a good reason. He's a good man, and I don't feel like he'd lie to you for no reason. He probably just wanted to protect you. You were 8 after all." He slid his thumbs over the backs of my hands like I liked, and I smiled as I bent forward to kiss his forehead. "Thanks, hon. You always know just what to say." John grinned through his beard and reached for the controller again. Boy-friendly duties now complete. Besides, it's not all that weird if you think about it. I cocked an eye at him. "What do you mean?" "Well, that's where my dad took Russell after he got hit by that car. He told me he took him to Mr. Sanders' farm so he could get better, but I guess he never did." That gave me pause. John had basically told me the same story my dad had, and it was a little too similar for coincidence. As John went back to rolling and smashing anything that wandered into his field of vision, I opened my phone and sent a text to my friend Matt. Matt and I had been friends nearly as long as John and I had, and I trusted him as much as I trusted my boyfriend. "Hey Matt, just wondering if you've ever heard your parents say anything about taking one of your pets to Sanders' farm. Just curious, trying to settle a bet." The last bit would really hook him. He seemed to like making John look dumb by proving him wrong. I watched John play Elden Ring for a few more minutes before my phone buzzed and I picked it up to see his reply. "Wow, that's weird. Yeah, my dad took Snoopy there. after he got too old to walk. I haven't thought about that in forever. That's trippy. I thanked him and sent a text to Jane, a friend from work. Jane lived in the next town over, but Kine was still only about 20 minutes from my hometown. I was wondering if this was just a regional thing, or if it extended farther than our little burg. Janet sent back a string of question marks and asked why I needed to know something so weird. I told her it was to settle a bet too, and she told me she'd never had a dog get taken to Sanders' farm. We always just buried them in the backyard, she said. Okay, so maybe it wasn't particularly far-reaching. For the next few hours, as John cursed and growled at the maddening boss he was trying to beat, I sent text after Facebook message after Twitter message and everything in between to old school friends and people I knew from town to ask them if they'd lost dogs too. John's story about Russell had made me realize this was bigger than just my family, and I wanted to know how far exactly. Of the 10 people I got responses from, 6 said their parents had told them they were taking dogs to Sanders' farm. One friend only had cats growing up, and it appeared that they didn't get to live a happy life on Sanders' farm. The other 2 had never been allowed to have pets, so they'd never had anything to lose. The one person whose dog hadn't gone to Sanders' farm had escaped while the family was on vacation, so the whereabouts of the dog were never discovered. The findings were inconclusive, but they were still pretty damn close. Close enough that as John and I climbed into bed that night, I had already decided that I was going to make a stop on my way home from work tomorrow. The plume of dirt that spewed up behind me as I drove up the long driveway to Sanders' farm was the only bell the old farmer seemed to need. He was waiting for me on the porch with a glass of tea, and a weathered old smile spread across his sunburnt face. "Afternoon, kid. What can I do for you?" We shook hands as I introduced myself, and he handed me the glass of tea as I explained why I was there. Mr. Sanders nodded, asking if I'd like to come inside. He didn't seem surprised by the question at all. Quite the contrary. It was as if he'd been waiting for me to come and ask it all this time. I told him that I thought I'd rather sit on the porch and discuss it, and he nodded as he took a seat in one of the old rockers, indicating that I should take the other. Every now and again, someone puts 2 and 2 together and realizes that everyone brings their dogs to Sanders' farm. It's not a new concept. People have been doing it since before the Great Depression. I can't tell you how long it's been going on, but I can tell you how it started if you'd like to hear. I nodded, and he began his story. The first dog to be brought here wasn't really brought at all. His name was Jip, and he was my friend. He was just a pup when I heard him crying one afternoon. He'd gotten himself stuck in a trap, and his pack had deserted him, probably thinking he was done for. He was just a little half-starved thing, but he growled at me as I came to get him loose. Turned out I didn't have to do too much. The trap had nearly tore his front paw off, and he was bleeding out. It seemed a shame to let him die, so I held him down and tied his foot off with a handkerchief. He struggled a lot, snapping and snarling as I tried to stop the bleeding, but eventually he quieted down as the blood oozed out of him and he became less coherent. I scooped him up and took him back home, cutting the little bit of skin off that held his paw on and dressing it as best I could. I was afraid he had died for a little while, but when I heard him come to, snarling and snuffling and howling, I knew he'd likely recover. He smiled as he remembered it, likely thinking of the little wolf pup as he tried to act twice his size. We started off slow, but eventually I earned his trust. His paw would never grow back, but he managed to teach himself to walk with 3 legs. I had done a good enough job of cleaning it up that it didn't get infected, and after a few months, the lack of a paw didn't seem to slow him down. He couldn't return to his pack. I'm not sure he ever even tried, but he was my dog after that, and I loved him. His smile became sad, and I felt we were about to come to the part of the story where he lost that friend. We lived together for about 12 years, both of us growing old as the seasons passed. Jip's gait was slower, and his joints creaked when he walked, but he was still always willing to walk around with me when I did my work. I was in my late 40s, working the land as I do now, when we stumbled upon a bear one day. He had decided to bed down in my corn crib, and when I went down to check my stores, he woke up and charged me. Jip got between us. He was never far from my side, and gave me time to get my rifle. I put the bear down as the three-legged wolf kept him from attacking me, but the damage was done. Jip had been slashed a dozen times, and I sat with him as he lay bleeding on the dirt floor of my storehouse. Mr. Sanders got a far-off look as he watched the sun sink, seeing far-off days as the sun set over his crops. I buried him in the field, the place he loved the most. I'd built him a house, put him a ratty blanket on the porch, but he seemed to love sleeping amongst the swaying corn plants and amidst the dirt of the field. I buried him there, thinking he might nourish the crops as his spirit lay content, but I never could have foreseen what would happen. That night, I heard a loud barking, a barking that sounded like Jip's. I rushed out with my rifle and found him smiling and barking at the edge of the field, good as new. Behind him, though, the crops had grown 4 times as plentiful. Corn and beans and squash and potatoes, everything else I grew in those days, too. Jip looked at me as though to say, "Thanks for a good life," and then he dove back into the field and I never saw him again. That was how it started. "Well, what started?" I asked, feeling my skin prickle. "The crops came in, and I brought my wares to the nearest market. I made enough money to build a new barn, buy a new horse, and eat like a king that winter. There had been enough food to stuff my storehouse, and the excess I'd taken to market was more like a normal yield from any other year. The next year I planted as I had every year, and old Jip brought in another bountiful harvest. I bought more land, made plans to plant an orchard, began to think about buying cattle and sheep. I even thought about becoming some kind of land baron in this underdeveloped part of the country. The next 2 years were just as fine, but I was in for a surprise." He coughed a little and asked me if I'd get him a glass of tea from the kitchen. I obliged, moving into the house and taking a glass from the cabinet as I moved to the battered old fridge. I refilled my own as I poured the cold tea into the new glass. I was suddenly very thirsty, and my throat felt dry as a bone. When I brought it back to him, he thanked me before taking a long sip. After 4 years of amazing yield, the 5th year was a disappointment. The crops did well as they ever did before Jip died, but the bounty was nowhere to be seen. I had just begun planting the fruit trees and just started making inquiries about livestock. I worried that I wouldn't be able to afford any of the plans I'd been making, and that temporary success might just slip through my fingers. The next year was much the same, but I had noticed a small decline in the quality of my produce. There had been no blight, no insects to speak of, but the crops seemed weaker, more feeble this year. I began to panic. What would I do if the fields stopped making? What could I do if the vegetables stopped coming? I tried different things that spring to rejuvenate the fields. I bought tonics from a traveling man. I put down fertilizer. I tried increasing the water I gave the fields. The fertilizer, however, had made me remember that I had used something very different to fertilize the land 4 years ago, and that made me wonder if doing so might rejuvenate the fields again. The sun was sinking lower now, the fiery ring just over the tops of the corn as they waved merrily. And so I set out to find a proper sacrifice for the land, something to bring it back again. I tried forest animals. Jip had been of the forest after all, but to no avail. I tried strays from the nearby town, but they did nothing. In my desperation, I'm ashamed to say that I bought and killed animals from the local stableman, even going so far as to buy and slaughter a horse, but they did little to rejuvenate the crop. Then one evening, as I came back from the market with my pathetic yield, I nearly struck a child as he came bounding into the road. The dog with him, just an average mutt, pushed him out of the way, and my tires crunched over the animal. I heard the boy cry out in despair as he cradled the dying dog in his arms. Its back was clearly broken, but I wasted no time. I took the dog with me, driving away quickly as the father came rushing out to see what all the fuss was about. The setting sun cut fire lines across his eyes, and the sting must have been uncomfortable, if not eye-watering. Mr. Sanders seemed not to notice, though. He was dead by the time I arrived home,
and I buried him in the field, as I had with Jip. The crops came back, the land thrived, and I think that was when I realized what the land wanted. The old dog had been loved, just as Jip had been loved, and that love seemed to nourish the land like nothing else. From that day on, I seemed to always have my eyes peeled for dogs. The sick ones could sometimes be taken off the owner's hands, but I had been known to buy them from struggling families as well. As the years went by and the town grew, so too did my prosperity. I was one of the largest farmers in the region. My produce sold at every general store and market for miles around. I've seen the horses replaced by automobiles, seen the carts that came to get my food replaced by trucks, and all the while, my fields continue to put out more of the stuff I needed to grow. Ah, but there was a price, and the price has become quite steep over the years. I was still mulling over what he had said, and when he paused to drain the dregs of his glass, I asked the question that had been wavering on the edge of my mind. "Mr. Sanders, how old are you?" Mr. Sanders fixed me with a mischievous grin, and it took years off of him. "Just starting to put it together, eh? I was born in 1815. I bought this land in 1845. The year I buried Jip, I was 45, and I have stayed that age ever since. Despite having more crops than I know what to do with, the land also grants me life for my sacrifice. I can't explain why, and I can't explain how, but I keep living as long as the land thrives." I wanted to deny what he was saying, but I could find no argument against it. The man looked old, sun-weathered, but not ancient. How would he manage to keep from being noticed? If he had really owned this farm for so long, how had no one seen? As my farm grew, so too did the town. The market thrived, the people prospered, and thus began the agreement. I had grown tired of finding my own sacrifices, so I made them a deal. They would bring me their dogs, those who were sick or those who were too old to carry on, and I would continue to make the town flourish. By that time, I was making a sacrifice once a month. Today, I make a sacrifice once a day. Before too long, I fear that it will become unmanageable, and the farm will fail." I said nothing, just sitting and staring, wishing I could believe that this man was crazy. I suppose that wouldn't be too bad. I've grown tired of living and making sacrifices, and maybe it's finally time to rest. Nothing lasts forever after all, not even immortality, he said, grinning. The grin made his face look skeletal, his true age shining through at last. I thanked him for the tea, thanked him for the story, and stood up shakily. "Take care of yourself, kid, and don't worry. Old Blue is as happy as any other dog here. You did what you could for him, and now he's at rest where no one can hurt him ever again." I nodded dumbly, my legs shivering as I walked down the stairs to my car. As I climbed in, I thought I saw a familiar brown snout as it poked from the rows of corn plants. My hands froze halfway to the ignition. He was grinning at me, looking out through the corn and panting happily. It was as if he had come back one last time to say goodbye, and as we locked eyes, he slid slowly back into the field. I've driven by that farm once a day since, but I've never seen Blue again. I do worry, though, about what will happen to all those ghosts if something should happen to Sanders' farm. The crops have begun to look a little different lately, less healthy, more like plants that are rotting from the inside. If the vegetables die, if the farm fails, then what will happen to all those spirits that call the land their home? There was a sign next to the dirt road today that said, "For sale by owner." I suppose soon we may very well find out. I can't explain it, but the butterflies seem to know where the bodies are. I've been a park ranger since I was 18. After 5 years, I really can't imagine doing anything else. I was in the Scouts when I was younger, and have been an avid hiker all my life.
Time spent in the woods is time well spent, and the ability to work there every day is absolutely a dream come true for me. Being a park ranger, you see your fair amount of bodies in the woods. People come out here to hike and swim and forget that there are things here that will kill you. They run afoul of animals, they get sucked into the rapids, they don't pack enough food or water, and they just get lost and aren't found till someone chances upon them. Spring 2023 was the year that we got some help from the butterflies. It started with the death of Angel Myers, but it certainly didn't end there. Angel Myers was what you would call a minimalistic camper. She would come in with a few essentials, just kind of camp wherever she decided to drop down. She knew which plants would kill her and which ones would nourish her, which was good. She also knew which plants would get her higher than airplane wings, which was bad. We had called the cops on Angel several times, but they always cut her loose a few days later, and the rangers refused to toss her a lifetime ban from the park, and she just kept coming back. When a pair of hikers told us they had found a body in an area we knew as the Meadow, we supposed this would be the last time we had to call the cops on her. She was naked, and it wasn't the first time many of us had seen her in this state. She wasn't bad to look at, but it's always a little weird to find someone stark naked in the elements. She was splayed out, spread eagle, in the flowers that grew in the meadow, and her eyes and tongue were missing. That wasn't terribly uncommon either, not with all the varmints in the park, but the little black growths on her skin were definitely something I'd never seen before. She had 3 rows of perfect little spikes, each of them about 3 inches long, and each line about 9 spikes long. Other than the spikes, the strangest part of the whole scene was the butterflies. They weren't a species I was familiar with, and they were bone white with light black patterns on their wings. They were thick over the body, and I assumed that they had been what had drawn the hikers. They were circling in a cloud, the white easily seen against the green canopy around them, and I was as amazed by them as I was the weird protrusions on her skin. "What the hell are these?" I asked, reaching out a finger to test if they were sharp, but finding them squishy and full of green liquid instead. "Pallida morse," Rico, one of the other rangers I worked with, said. "One more time in English for the rest of us," I said. "Pale death," he said, pointing to the butterflies. "They're rare. I don't think I've seen one in the flesh. They're supposed to live in the deep woods, and they only come out every few years to lay eggs." I pointed to the little row of spikes running up her thigh. "On corpses?" Rico nodded. "That's why they call them Pallida morse. They lay eggs on corpses, though it's usually of animals. I've heard of them laying eggs on human bodies, but it's rare. I guess they found the corpse before we did." The hikers said about the same thing when we questioned them. They'd been hiking to the meadow, his fiancée wanting to see it in the spring, and as they came to the end of the trail, she had noticed the swarm of pale butterflies and wanted a closer look. She had thought they were pretty, but as she got that closer look, they'd seen the body and realized they were swarming around it. We called the station and got some guys from the coroner's office down to pick her up. We hoped she would somehow be the last body we found that spring, but I think even then, I knew it wouldn't be the last body I saw taken out of the park that year. The next one was a hiker named Marcus Dre, and his death was truly terrible. Some campers had gone fishing in the Connoisseur River, the waterway that runs through the park, and as they chased the trout that were beginning their journey to the spawning ground, one of their kids came across a grisly sight. He said it looked like a scaled claw was sticking out of the river, and he ran to his mother thinking it was a monster. She had expected to find a rock formation or maybe a stick with some moss on it. But what they found was an arm covered in the black spike pods the butterflies leave behind. "They looked like scales," the mother had said, still a little shaken by the experience, and I could understand why he thought it was a monster's hand. It wasn't until I got closer that I realized the arm was jutting up from the foam. At first, we thought the guy had just fallen into the river and gotten stuck behind the rocks after drowning. When we pulled him out, however, we got a better idea of the extent of the damage. Somehow, he had been forced into a small space between the 2 rocks, and they hadn't done it gently. His shoulders were broken, like snapped in the middle and just folded up. He was crumpled up like a suit coat in the hole, and that wasn't all. Something had eaten his face. Not like Angel, where the eyes and tongue were missing. They had eaten his entire face off, skinned him down to the skull, and there was nothing left but ragged flesh and scored white bone. If it hadn't been for the arm sticking up, we might have never found him until someone panning for minerals had found a skull or a finger. The butterflies, the pale death, had presided over everything as we managed to get him onto the shore. After that, we found 4 more bodies in a month. One was left on a mountainside, its hands missing and its nose and lips chewed off. He'd been climbing the low-grade mountain that we have on the grounds, and when he'd gone missing, we thought he might have been in a small avalanche due to the snow melt. When a fisherman found him laid out on the lowest peaks, however, we knew it was something much worse. The second was a woman who'd gone into the woods to relieve herself during a picnic, and was found in the low branches of a tree. Well, half of her was. The other half was high up in the tree, and something had eaten her legs. The husband had to be hospitalized after he identified the top half of his wife, and I felt bad for the kids. They'd been here to enjoy a picnic in the park, and something had taken that away from them. The third was, unfortunately, a child named Caitlin Mills. Caitlin would have been 6 in July, but she never got the opportunity. Caitlin was the strangest, and also the easiest to identify. Caitlin had left her parents' campsite in the night, but it appeared that whatever had found her had taken an interest in her. Something had taken care of her in the woods. Something had fed her. Something had changed her clothes. Something had made sure she drank clean water, and then, unfortunately, its care had lapsed. Caitlin hadn't died because her face had been eaten off. She had died because her skull had connected with the ground and cracked. It was pretty clear that she had fallen out of a tree, but the coroner said that she would have needed to fallen from a pretty steep height. She was stretched out, too, as if something had made her comfortable as she lay dying. The fourth was the worst, and the reason for what came after. The fourth was Ranger Franklin Carpenter, and he'd gone missing after going to check one of the pump stations. We had 6 pump stations, things we used to bring clean water to the campsites, and he'd been responding to a call about a malfunction in Station 4. He had gone out before lunch, and we found what was left of him the next day, after he never came back. If he hadn't died wearing his name tag, then we wouldn't have known who it was. His arms and legs were missing, and believed to have been eaten. His face was gone, as was the top of his skull and what lay within. Something had gnawed his chest, eaten his buttocks, chewed his genitals off for good measure. It was just a torso and part of a head when we found him on the edge of the woods, and a lot of us got pretty scared after losing one of our own like that. Over all 4 bodies, the butterflies held sway, and their eggs were in evidence. I expected a visit from the head ranger, but when he arrived with a man in a black suit the next day, we should have known that something was about to happen. He had a few other men in similar attire, and Rico lifted an eyebrow as we took our seats at briefing. None of these guys were dressed for more than a slow stroll over a concrete path, but I doubted that was their intention. Agent Lee has been gracious enough to come and help us with our problem. We'll be splitting into groups so you can canvass the woods. We need to find whatever is doing this before summer starts, especially with one of our own being a recent casualty. We have a lot of ground to cover, so Rangers will be splitting up with 2 of Agent Lee's boys to show them the trails and help them bring this to a close. So that's how I found myself in the woods with Agent Feist and Agent Martin. Agent Lee might have looked like an investment banker, but these 2 had traded their Brooks Brothers suits for camo and assault rifles. We had broken out shotguns that we used to put off angry wildlife to supplement the firepower that the agents had brought, and the 3 of us proceeded through the woods. Agent Feist wasn't a big talker, but Agent Martin made up for it by asking questions about what we had seen. I told him about the bodies, the parts that had been eaten, and the butterflies that seemed to hover around everything. "Butterflies?" Feist said, and it was probably the only thing I'd heard him say in the hour that we'd been walking. "Yeah, Rico calls them something in Latin that basically means pale death. They show up around the bodies and just kind of mark where they are." Feist gave Martin a look, and the two nodded knowingly. "Have you seen anything near the sites? Footprints or scales, maybe. Stuff like insect skin?" I shook my head. "No, mostly just dead people." I was preparing to ask them what they thought they were looking for, since they clearly knew something, when we came through a dense stand of trees and into an open space that was anything but open. It seemed infested with the pale butterflies, and as we stalked in, they fluttered around us almost gladly. The two agents took this as a good sign, but weren't sure what to think. These things had been a pretty foul omen in the last few months, and finding a huge number of them now seemed less than ideal. As we moved into the cloud of butterflies, it also seemed like something was stalking us. Through the thick waves of insects, there was a large shadow that followed us. It almost appeared human-sized, but the longer I watched it flit through the swarm, it seemed to grow. It may have had as few as 2 arms, or as many as 8, but the wings I saw stir its smaller kin were what worried me. They were tall and white, just like the others, and it seemed to be using them as a blind to lure us in deeper. "It's close," Martin whispered. "Steady," Feist said. "If we spook him, he might fly away before we can take him out." "What?" I half whispered, talking too loud, but too scared to care. Feist looked at Martin, shrugging at something on the other's face. "You've heard of the Mothman. Well, there's a counterpart to that thing. The people of Joplin talk about how many of their children were saved from a tornado by these butterfly people, but they assume those who were lost were taken by that tornado, and not the same creatures who saved them. We call them Lycadia bipoptus, and they are extremely..." But he never got a chance to finish. Suddenly the cloud of butterflies enveloped us, their small bodies clinging to us as they struck. Our vision was cut off, and as the automatic weapons chattered, I hit my belly and started crawling. I wanted to get out of the swarm, to get away from the wild bark of the guns, and as I crawled, I heard somebody yelling. The wet sound of something being torn cut off some of the screaming, but the gunfire persisted as I kept making my way out of the cloud of insects. I kept crawling until I made it out of the clearing. Once I was no longer being buffeted by butterflies, I got up and started running. I could still hear the gunfire behind me, but I knew that what I wanted was to live. I knew that if I stayed, I'd be dead, and I still very much wanted to live. I ran until someone yelled at me to stop and shoved a gun in my face. It was another one of the agents, and as they all coalesced, I was ordered to take them back to the spot where I had left Agent Feist. As little as I wanted to go back, I agreed. By the time I got back, Feist was sitting on something he had covered with a tarp. Feist's left hand was hanging uselessly at his side. His clothes were ripped to shreds, but he was grinning like a big game hunter who'd bagged the big one. "Get it to the truck. Tell the boys back at base I had no choice but to kill it. It refused to come peacefully and forced my hand." Martin was dead, his body covered in a slew of crushed butterflies. I saw him before they could tarp him as well. Something had torn his throat out, and I assumed it was whatever was under the big tarp that Feist was guarding. They took both the tarped bodies away, and when Feist came towards me, I was worried he would be angry that I'd fled. He put a hand on my shoulder instead and nodded in understanding. "Don't feel bad, kid. I would have run too if I'd had the choice. Both Agent Martin and I knew what we were getting into. You got us here. That's what counts." They took it away, and the murders stopped. We lost 2 more hikers that year, but they were both killed by the elements. The butterflies left that same day, never, hopefully, to return. I can't help but think about that spring again, as winter abates and the seasons get warmer. I tell you one thing, I'll be keeping an eye peeled for butterflies from now on. You never know when they and a new horror might show up again.